Hi everyone. We will be learning today the holy Alshich HaKadosh Torah Moshe in the holy city of Tzfat with the Alshich Academy. This week we'll be learning about Yacov Avinu's end of days, his last few days on earth, and all about how he interacted with Yosef and his wish where he wanted to be buried, and all of the deep secrets that are lying underneath the simple meaning of the words. So without further ado, we should be zocher to understand these holy Torahs from Moshe. And the Parsha begins, Vayechi Yacov, and Yacov lived, Beretz Mitzrayim, 17 shana. He lived in Egypt for 17 years. Vayu Yemei Yacov, and the days of Jacob, Shnei Chayav, the years of his life, totaled the amount of Sheva Shanim, ve'arba'im u'mat shana. 7 years and 140 years. Total of 147 years. Says Rabbi Moshe Lavo al Biur HaKatuv, in order to understand the pasuk, we will pay attention to the details as we do with Rabbi Moshe, and we'll see what's going on here. So first of all, the first question all the commentaries ask is the following question: El stimat ha-parasha lefi pshat. Usually every parasha, the Torah has 53 parashas, 53 different portions, and each portion usually is split up into many portions of parashot, where in the Torah, in the scroll, you'll see either a 9-letter space or enter to the next line. A new line begins, and those describe a new portion. So that's called a parasha. But then this term is actually borrowed in its use regarding the 53 portions of the Torah, the way we just split up the parashot every week being a different portion. And usually the rule is that the weekly portion always begins by the beginning of one of the smaller portions. It never begins in the middle of a section. This is the only exception to the rule, that we have a parasha that begins in the middle of a parasha, which means that there's no space, there's no break or pause insinuated in the Torah. And that's the question that all the commentaries ask: why do we begin a new parasha without making any break in between the events of last week and then what's being discussed this week? It should obviously, if it's a new parasha, be a new discussion. So the Rabbi, as we know, Rashi brings the fact that the parasha stuma means there's a certain blockage being mentioned here, whether it was the hearts and eyes of the Jewish people. Once Yacov died, there was a spiritual decline, the beginning of the spiritual exile, which eventually descended into physical exile. That already began with Yaakov's departing, and that caused the blockage or the lack of wide consciousness, which would be described in space in between the parasha. The fact there's no space describes a certain limitation, like the Mitzrayim, the constriction of Mitzrayim. That's the Rashi and the Midrash, or the fact that Yaakov's knowledge of the end of days was removed from him, and his consciousness was his stream of consciousness was blocked. But Rav Moshe said these are all nice midrashim, which obviously they're very deep. But Rav Moshe says obviously there's the simple explanation of the fact that this is very clearly describing a continuation between last week's end of last week's parasha and the beginning of this week's parasha, clearly indicating that there is no break. There is no breakdown of narrative. It's a complete continuation of last week following into this week. So Rav Moshe is going to say, what is this describing? What's specific about this week's continuation of last week that we would therefore not have the break? Says Rav Moshe, question number 2. Kim pasuka kodem. Now let's actually go, says Rav Moshe, into the events described in the previous parasha, which we're now saying seemingly is a continuation. We are continuing from that. It says in the last parasha, Vayechi Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim be'eretz Goshen, and Israel settled in the land of Egypt, in the land of Goshen. Pasuk hazeh, however, in this parasha begins, and Yacov lived in the land of Egypt. It doesn't doesn't feel it's necessary to specify that we're talking about the Goshen province of Mitzrayim. We just say the land of Egypt. So what's the difference between the end of last parasha and this parasha? Then we have question number 3. Ma tzorech b'pasuk hakodem lahodienu ki he'achzu ba. The pasuk says, last week's parasha finishes off, the Israelites, or Yacov and his family, Israel and his family, settled in the land of Egypt, in the area of Goshen, Vayechi ba, and they held on to it, meaning they inherited it, they made it theirs. Why is that an important, necessary step, describing their dwelling in that area? Number 4, Lama piret chayav be'eretz Mitzrayim. Velama lo piret ma shechaya b'chol echad me'makomot asher gar sham. Why does the Torah only talk about the amount of time he lived in Egypt, and don't describe how many years he lived in all the other places he lived? Number 5, כי אחר שהאסוד עתיד לכלול כל סך ימיו, יאמר בתחילה ויחי יעקב 7 שנים, ולא יפרט כלל. So why does it have to mention the fact that he lived in Egypt for 17 years? It seems to be that if you would just say that he lived a total of 147 years, we would be able to deduct the fact that 17 years of those were in Mitzrayim, because last week's parasha, he mentions to Paro that he's 130. So if you do a little bit of first grade maths, you would see that would end up being 17 years in Egypt. Number 6, כי אומרו ימי יעקב הוא מיותר. והיה ראוי יאמר ויהי שני חייו. So the pasuk starts off Vayechi Yacov. We know we're talking about Yacov. And then it says Vayehi Yemei Yacov. The days of Jacob, Shnei Chayav, the years of his life. Why is it important to mention? It seems very superfluous. Vayehi Yemei Yacov. Shnei Chayav. It should just say the years of his life, 147. What's the days of Yaakov? The years of his life. Number 6, ki omra ime Yaakov miyutar, as we just said. Number 7, omra vayehi ki mahara'ui omar vayiyu. Well, here we're talking about the years of Jacob, which is plural, many years. It says vayehi, and it was the years. It doesn't say and they were the total of it says and it, and that seems to be talking about 1 year, not 147 years. Says the Rav Moshe as follows. Now, in order to understand what's going on here, we're going to go back to the last time Yaakov Avinu's age was mentioned, which is in last week's parasha, while he is being introduced to Paro. Paro asked Yaakov how old he was. And what was Yaakov's response? The years of my dwelling, was as 130 years. And then he says, Ma'at v'ra'im hayu, my days were little in number and bad in nature. So says Rav Moshe, this seems very strange. Why is Yaakov getting so grumbly? If you get 130 years of life, you should be very happy about that. You should accept it with grace. Why is he seeming to be such a complainer with his years? Number 2, he says, my years haven't reached, he continued saying, the years of my fathers, Yaakov and Yitzchak and Avram. So what does it mean your years haven't reached? They also were 130 at some point, and then they became older. How does he know that he's not going to live up to their ripe old age? Number 3, he starts off saying, the years of my dwelling, megurai, like lashon of ger. And then he says, the years of my life. So what's the difference between the years of my life and the years of my dwelling? It says that my years didn't reach the years of my fathers in their dwelling. So what's going on here? So this obviously, Yaakov isn't just saying a simple complaint. We have to now understand what he's saying, because Yaakov is a wise man, and he's meeting, the leader of the not so free world at the time, and he's telling him something. So what is he telling him? Achine amru rabbeinu zal al pasuk ki orech yamim ushnot chaim. This is a Gemara in Yuma that says the following: there are days that are days of life. There are years that that can be considered shnot chaim. Ela mi shechayav b'shalva hem shel chaim. If one has a life of serenity, of peace, that is considered life. Aval chayei tsar einam shel chaim. Years that a person goes through in suffering, in pain, is not considered years of life. It's considered years that he's alive, but it's not years of life. So therefore, with this introduction, we'll now understand what Yacov is saying. Paro, in his question, asked him the following: Kama yemei shnei chayecha? How many of the days of your life, of your chayim? So Yacov had to clarify, when you ask me how many years of life I had, that's not that many, because when I hear Yaakov's telling Paro, when I hear you asking how many years of life I had, that insinuates years of peace and serenity. Shemoreh al shnot chayim v'shalva. Anav amar, so that Yaakov responded to that, Lo shnot chayim hayalu. Most of my years were not years of life. Ki im shel megurim. My life was a life of displacement. Gerut v'tiltul. I was always a foreigner. I was always moving from place to place, which really doesn't have the quality of life that you would have in a life of peace and stability. V'zeu shloshim u'ma'at shana. Hayu yemei shnayei megurai. 130 years I have lived, years of dwelling. Megurai, like gerim. Shema tomar hayitachen sheben shnei megurim la hayu k'tzat shnot chayim. So you're telling me that out of all the 130 years, there was only suffering and displacement, there was no years of stability at all? L'zeh amar da'efo ki ma'at v'ra'im hayu asher yikaru shnot chayim. So even the years that I wasn't being displaced, even the years that I was able to be settled in a place for a period of time, first of all, those years were very few. And second of all, those years, even though they were stable, they weren't necessarily peaceful in terms of the events that I went through and the states of mind that I had to be subject to during those years. So that's what he's saying. Even those years of serenity weren't really many, and they weren't very peaceful at all altogether. There was always some kind of negative things happening to him during these years. So you're telling me, okay, what's the big deal? You're not the first person in your family to go through displacement and trials and tribulations. Avram and Yitzchak also had to go around and travel and go through suffering with different things they went through. So why are you making such a big fuss out of your life? He's saying, my fathers also went through some stuff, but their years of serenity, at least when they did have peaceful lives, they had some periods of serenity. However, mine were very, very few and far between, and even then they weren't that good to begin with. Periodically, in between the years of displacement, they had a few years of stability. However, me in my bitter state, even the few years that I did have a bit of stability, I had way less and way fewer years of stability. So now that we understand Yaakov's life and the patterns of his experiences in his world, Yaakov had a life. Vayechi is insinuating years of life. Which period in his life can you refer to as years of life? Lo hayu rak be'eretz Mitzrayim. Shvas Rishona. Yacov only had 17 years that he lived, that you could refer to them as years of life. V'zeu Vayechi. These are years that you could say that he lived. V'hu ki zeh darkan shel bnei Adam. So now Rabbi Moshe is going to tell us a very interesting thing. It's like people say that the entire meal is really depending on how the dessert was. Because if you have an entire meal that's not mediocre food, but if the dessert was good, you go home with a good flavor and a good taste in your mouth, and like, yeah, that was a good meal. So he says the same is true with a person's life. Ki im 1000 shanim yichyeh b'shuva v'nachat. If a person would have a great life, with success and everything he wants, v'achrito mara b'ktzat shanim, the last few years of his life was very bitter, ad yared b'yagon shola, till he's died in his deathbed, he's been suffering for the last period of his life. It's as if the first section of his life that was successful is non-existent. In his mindset, he'll feel like his life was a life filled with suffering. And the same is true the other way around. If a person would live a difficult life his whole life, however the last period of his life is positive and happy, and he'll die peacefully and happily in the good old age, then that will change the entire perspective. With a few years of good, he'll forget his entire suffering. That will now reframe his entire life as one unified positive experience. So even though we learned in last week's Parsha that Yacov referred to his life as years of displacement and suffering, and even the years that were stable, there were so few and far between that they didn't even count. But now we're saying you should know that the last 17 years, Vayechi Yacov, 17 years Yacov did have life-filled life. Years full of life and good. And therefore, this now reinterpreted and reframed his entire life. Now this period caused Yaakov's his entire life. So before we had a question, why does it say the days of Yaakov and the years of his life? So now Rabbi Moshe is saying you have to understand the Parsha differently. That because he had 17 years of life, of good life, therefore, Vayiyu Yemei Yacov, the entire sum total of Yaakov's days, became Shnei Chayav, became life-filled years. Ki atu ka'ata kanu avaya chadasha. They have now been reacquired in a new way. They've been completely recalibrated into a new type of life perspective. V'nasu kulam shnot chayim. Why does it say in a singular way? There's another question we asked. It doesn't say and they were, it says it was, to point out that now the way his life became reframed as positive was because they now were reacquired as one whole sum total of life. So the fact that they now come together as one is what makes them into good years. And this is actually a very interesting thing that the Zohar HaKadosh talks about, that the best years of Yaakov's life were in Mitzrayim, and there's different explanations as to why that is. How could you say that Yaakov's best years are in Chutz La'aretz? The Zohar HaKadosh talks about it, and different Sfarim, the Bat Ayin has a Torah, the Bavish Rabbi, and the general gist of the Tzaddikim that talk about this thing is that, as we know, that the best situations are brought out in times in places of challenge, in teams when we go into a place of Tumah, that is when the biggest kedusha is able to be brought out, paradoxically, That's what the general idea of this is. But Moshe is saying that actually on a physical level, yeah, he finally, he had his son with him. He wasn't being chased by any by Esav. He wasn't being chased by the Shechem people. He wasn't being tricked by Lavan. He finally had a peaceful life. His son is the king of the land, giving him whatever he needs. He had royal protection, and it was a great retirement plan. You go to Egypt and live off of the king's coffers, being the son of the king. Yeah. So that was the. This is a bit shaky. It's fine. So now Moshe continues as follows. So here comes the potential problem. So you're right that the Mitzrayim was a beautiful place to live. It was peaceful and it was prosperous for him. However, there's the spiritual aspect to be considered as well. And Egypt is the place of immense tumah. And if what would happen by the fact that they lived in Egypt would have affected him and his family, or at least his family, would have been affected by the impurity and the lack of Kedusha that existed in Mitzrayim, then it wouldn't have been worth it. Yacov is not looking to have a peaceful life materially if that's going to affect the holiness of his family. So that's why the Torah has to now address the fact whether the impurity of Egypt had an effect on Jacob's family. So he says as follows. If the Jewish people would actually have lived in Mitzrayim proper, then they would have to have been affected by the tumah of Mitzrayim, because as we know, every land has a spiritual energy, an angel, a ministering angel in heaven that is in charge or channels the energy of this country, of this land through him. And therefore anybody that's living in this place and living off the produce this place produces is going to have be affected by the energy of this angel. So if the Jewish people would have had to live in Mitzrayim proper, then it wouldn't have been worth it. However, they didn't live in Egypt. They lived in where? In Goshen. What was Goshen? Goshen was different. As we're going to see, Ramosh is going to introduce to us what was the story with Goshen. So let's see. So first of all, he says, if they would have to live in Mitzrayim, there would be two problems. First of all, they would have to live under the jurisdiction of the Sar of Mitzrayim, who was a very negative, God-opposing angel. The physical land of Mitzrayim was also very, very impure. Hashem calls Eretz Mitzrayim the erva of Eretz Israel. We know that the erva is the impure state of sexual desires. We know that the Brit Kodesh, the most holy place of a human person, of a Jewish person's body, is the Brit Kodesh. So now Mitzrayim, who were their entire land, was the impure version of the Brit Kodesh, which is the diametrically opposed version of a Jewish Brit. So they were the Ervat Haaretz. So it's like the most, the sin city of the world was Mitzrayim. So that was the worst place for a Jew to be. Yaakov's happiness would have been completely destroyed if this would have been the case, that the Jewish people had to live in Mitzrayim proper. It would be negative. All of this negative thing of being under the jurisdiction of this tumah would everything else would just pale in comparison compared to this level of failure, of disaster. So now Ramosh is going to explain to us why the Parsha this week is connected and doesn't have any break between this Parsha and the previous Pasuk and the last Parsha. Lechaber Pasuk ze el Pasuk shebesof Parsha kodemet. This is in order to connect the end of last Parsha to this Parsha. V'hu kisham ne'emar Vayechi Yisrael be'eretz Mitzrayim. There it says that Yacov lived in Mitzrayim, but not in Mitzrayim, in Eretz Goshen of Mitzrayim. And that is the introduction. We're going to see, Moshe is going to get to in a minute. This is the introduction as to why Yaakov's life in Mitzrayim was considered years of good life, because his children didn't have to live in Mitzrayim, they lived in Goshen. So now Moshe is first going to give us a little bit of a background, what Goshen was, how Goshen had this specific area, it was like a clean zone. It's like a quarantined, non-contaminated area that was allowed, that was perfect for the Jews. How did that come about to be? So the Pasuk says, when Yosef introduced Mitzrayim to his father as an option to move to, he said, you'll come to live in Mitzrayim, but don't you worry, you'll live in Goshen. So what's Goshen? What's specific about Goshen that is fine, that doesn't have the negative energy of Mitzrayim? Says Rav Moshe, we would understand this based on the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar. What does the Pirkei de Rabbi Elazar say? Ki Paro katav Eretz Goshen l'Sara b'ktuba. When Sarah was taken forcibly to be the wife of Paro, he wrote her a marriage contract, in which he wrote to her that the land of Goshen is hers as an inheritance. So he gave her a whole province in Mitzrayim to belong to her. Now, even though he didn't end up marrying her because the Hashem made sure that didn't happen. So it seems to be that the gift of Goshen will now be cancelled. However, it did remain hers. He gave it to her, notwithstanding any conditions. He just gave it to her either way. So now the land of Goshen belonged to Sarah. So now once it belongs to Sarah, v'kol nitna lava ita shela, al ken koach hatuma asher chayafef alea nistalek mimena. The tumah that existed on this portion of land, as exists all over Mitzrayim, didn't exist in the Goshen. Goshen was now tumah free. Where do we see a similar concept? When Avraham acquired the field from Ephron, the Pasuk says, and the Zohar explains, Vayakam hasadeh, and the field was elevated. Ki alidei shekna'a Avraham, through Avram's acquisition of the land, ki ma haytala, it became elevated and it was lifted out of its current state of low energy, being belonging to Ephron. V'yitron lamakom, the place now received extra holiness. So the same is true with Goshen. Al ken shalach kazot el aviv leimor. This is what he meant when he suggested to Yacov that he should live in Goshen. Al tachush imata v'zarecha tiyu mistavavim tachat Mitzrayim. I'm not suggesting that you come and live under the jurisdiction of the Egyptian rule. I'm telling you, v'yashavta be'eretz Goshen, come live in Goshen, ki en sham tumah. V'lo yatzarchem makom me'achad b'kedushat shorashei nafshotechem. You will still be able to be connected to the soul root that you are rooted in, even though you're in Egypt. So Moshe is here hinting to a very deep thing, that every Jew, specifically holy Jews like the Shvatim and Yacov Avinu, are rooted in a very spiritual place in Shamayim, but that can be blocked if they exist in an impure place physically. And we're going to see this also soon when Yaakov requests to be buried in Israel, that the place a person exists geographically has an effect on the ability of their soul to be connected in its place in heaven. And it's almost like you could say it's like, when you have like a cell phone jammer, like it's the energy of Mitzrayim kind of blocks the frequency of the soul. But the Yosef is telling Yaakov, don't you worry, in Goshen you won't have that jam. The Jews lived in Mitzrayim. So this is the last pasuk of the last week's Parsha. He said, don't you think that it was an issue when they lived in Mitzrayim? Why? Because it wasn't in the regular Mitzrayim, it was Eretz Goshen. They lived in Goshen, and therefore their connection to their soul in heaven, lo atzartam mileachez nafsham b'shorsham elyon. The energy in Goshen wasn't adversely affecting their ability to connect to their soul root in heaven. Ki im vayeachzu ba. They were able to hold on and stay connected to their source in heaven, ba'atzmam. Shehu b'shorsham hakadosh. So Moshe is saying an interesting explanation on the last few words in the Parsha last week. Vayeachzu ba. What's the last 5 words in last week's Parsha? They lived in Eretz Goshen, Vayeachzu ba, and they held on to her. Vayifru vayirbu ma'od, and they multiplied, and they became fruitful. They multiplied greatly. So what is that saying? So Moshe, this pasuk is describing the spiritual state of the Jews in Goshen, that their soul was able to hold on to its source in heaven, and just like Imeyotam ba. So he's saying here that the way he's explaining the passage is as follows: Vayeachzu, they were able to hold on to their personal connection in heaven, even though they were in the land of Goshen. Meaning the land of Goshen didn't affect their ability to hold on to their level of their soul. Or Yater Kipshuta, another version of understanding the same thing would be in the way to put it into the words of the pasuk. Ki kol Yisrael yesh lem achiza be'eretz Yisrael l'kedushata. Every Jew has a portion in the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel is the place that every Jew naturally belongs in. And that's kind of the channel that we connect to heaven, is through the land of Israel. Because the land of Israel is the physical manifestation of the physical world as it exists in the way it's supposed to be manifested in the ideal state. As it reflects heaven. So every Jew, that's the starting place, or the root of every Jewish person's soul is in that initial manifestation of the physical as it exists in the land of Israel, which is an elevated state of the physical. So what we're saying here is that even though they were in Goshen, they still were able to hold on to the land of Israel, because Goshen didn't prevent that. Whereas Mitzrayim would have been a blockage to be able to continue that level of connection. Vaharaya, what is the proof that the land of Goshen is spiritually non-adverse to holy connection? Vayifru vayirbu ma'od. The proof is in the pudding, that the Jewish people were able to multiply and grow both physically and spiritually. Meaning their connection to above natureness wasn't affected. If they were actually now put under the jurisdiction of the minister of Egypt in heaven, if they were actually under the jurisdiction of the Egyptian minister, they would not be able to have unnatural growth, because they would be limited in the level of Shefa coming down through this angel. So from the fact that they grew exponentially, if we look into the Midrash, it says that the children were born 6 in one pregnancy, or even 60, some say. Alright, the Midrash, very, very powerful Midrash, which needs to be understood, but at least 60 is the highest number. There's actually Rabbi Akiva who says that there was 600,000. There was one woman in Egypt that gave birth to 600,000 in one go. And Rabbi Akiva says that, he says, oh, you know what I mean, I'm talking about Moshe's mother. And Moshe was equivalent in quality to 600,000 Jews. But here it seems like Moshe is taking the understanding of 60 in one go to be literal. It could still be, he's not talking about literally, he's talking about the energy of birth, because birth is not only a physical thing. We know, for example, in the kavanot of prayers and of mitzvot, there's birth of new spiritual souls that happen through every mitzvah and every prayer. So birth isn't always referring to actual physical bodies. And it could be that in Mitzrayim, because they were doing so much birurim, right? Because we know, why did the Jews go to Egypt? Because there was lots of sparks, holy sparks, that needed to be elevated by just being there, and also by working there, etc. And because there was so much to do there in terms of collecting those sparks and perfecting them and doing the birurim and the sorting of the good from the bad, that every time we do a birur, it results in a new birth of spiritual energy coming forward into the souls of the people, into the souls of the world. So again, that could be also the explanation. He brings down here that the births here were also connected, were also on a spiritual level. Either way, the point is that this was only possible because they were in Goshen, and the fact that only the Jewish people multiplied on that level, and the Egyptians, even though they were close by, they had normal birth rates. That indicates that they were under different jurisdictions. The Jews were under the jurisdiction of the Kedusha, which because it was Sarah's province. But the Mitzrayim, Ba'atam, Ikarosh, Asa Mitzrayim, they weren't able to channel that type of multiplicity growth in their world. Al-Ken, now we understand how last week's parasha is a introduction and an explanation to Vayechi Yacov. Yacov had a good life. 17 years, the last 17 years of his life were years of life. Chayim v'tova. V'lo od, not only were they good on their own, they actually reframed his entire life. Ki gam kol hashanim rishonot that was suffered, there was the me'megurim v'tzar, now he can be renamed Shnot Chayim Yikar. Now they're called good years. Ve'en zeh ki'im l'ma shekol zaro hayu nechazim b'kedusha. The only way this was possible, the only way Yaakov was able to have good years while he was in Egypt, was because we look back in last week's parasha, introducing the good years of Yaakov. How were Yaakov's years in Egypt good years? Because they lived in Goshen. V'alken satama parasha ki al v'shevayach zuba. Because they lived in Goshen and they were able to hold on to their spiritual root in heaven. Alken vayechi Yaakov shnot chayim. This is the only way it was possible for Yaakov to have years of good life in Mitzrayim. Yeah, so here in the bottom here he brings the entire Zohar that we mentioned before, that this is really the Zohar also describes this entire process that Rabbi Shimon says. Why is there no space between the two parashot? So says Rabbi Shimon, because you can't separate between the two. So the Zohar says his whole life was a life of suffering. When he came to Egypt and he saw his son, and he realized that they lived in Egypt but they were still holy, he became happy and he had good years. Again, the Zohar goes into different details, different explanations, but that's the same similar explanation that the Alshech is giving us. So now Alshech finishes off. So this is a very interesting thing. We just mentioned that if Yaakov's family would have been in Mitzrayim, that would have cut them off from the spiritual connection. They wouldn't have been able to continue being connected to the Kedusha. But that says Rav Moshe is only true regarding Yaakov's children. But Yaakov himself, he was unshakable. Yaakov himself, no matter where you exist geographically, he would remain holy. He would always remain alive. Ki kadosh hu le'elahav. Yaakov is so holy and so alive that doesn't make a difference to him. V'techi rucho gam sham b'Mitzrayim. Even if it would just be talking about himself, it would be fine. But it was for his family. That's where he needed the Goshen, and that's why in this week's parasha, this is another question we had before. Last week it says they were in Goshen. Here, when we're talking about Yaakov, it doesn't say Goshen, it just says Mitzrayim, to point out that Yaakov himself didn't need to be in Goshen, because he himself was on this level of holiness and completion. Yacov and tumat eretz ha'amim yichol alim shol bo. The land, the impurity of the lands wasn't able to affect him. Others who weren't on the level of wholesomeness that he was, al-ken b'shvil zaro be'eretz Goshen, he had to be in Goshen for his children. So this is an interesting message that Moshe is telling us, that we see in the Parsha here, that sometimes parents on their own have already figured it out, they're stable enough in their holiness to be able to live in a certain place or do certain things or be exposed to certain energies. But for the children, because the children aren't complete yet and they haven't yet worked out their lives through, sometimes for the children we have to make sure to be in a more secure zone, not exposed to the tumah of Mitzrayim or other tumahs, for the sake of the children, even though Yacov himself didn't. And if the children would have been affected, that would have affected Yacov as well, obviously, because all he cared about was having a holy family. So B'ezrat Hashem, we should be zocher to have a holy family and holy selves. And thank you Hashem. So we'll continue next time, B'ezrat Hashem.